monkey people. Welcome to We All Got Problems. My name is Zoe Ho, and this episode it's about mindfulness for teens and also for anyone who's having problems adulting. We get to meet with the incredible Dr. Dzung Vo. He is American, Canadian, Vietnamese. Dr. Dzung Vo is someone who integrates his experiences growing up in diverse communities and impacted by intergenerational trauma. He came upon the Buddhist master, Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh's teachings. And with that, he turned mindfulness into his superpower, integrating it into his work today as an adolescent medical specialist. He authored the book Mindfulness for Teens. He is the founder and director at the BC Children's Hospital's Center for Mindfulness. He is the division head of the BC Children's Hospital's Adolescent Medical Department. Dr. Dzung Vo is super cool and has made meditation accessible to so many. He shares with us stories about how mindfulness has been integrated into medical care for teenagers struggling with some really heavy and challenging life moments. This is both touching and inspiring. And also super practical if you're looking for ways to do adulting better or to take care of your inner teenager. So without further ado, let's jump into this cozy conversation with Dr. Dzung Vo. Welcome to We All Got Problems. We're really fortunate today to have conned somebody super awesome and a real expert to come on to our show. His name is Dzung Vo, and Zoom is somebody who has worked for many years in the fields of mindfulness and then integrating mindfulness into medicine for adolescents. Can we jump into, how did you come upon mindfulness and what would your life have been like if you never found mindfulness?
I love telling the story and also hearing other people's stories because I think we all come to mindfulness from different ways, and often it's through suffering, and also often it's really because of other people in our lives. And so in my case, I'm Vietnamese American Canadian. I was born in the United States. My family is Vietnamese, and my parents would actually pronounce my name in the Vietnamese way, which is either Yong or Zong, which has an accent, and I go by Zoom in English. When I'm speaking in English, but in Vietnamese, it's pronounced differently. And my father in particular has a long lineage in our family going back many generations of Vietnamese Buddhism. So it's very deep in my family. And in particular, I think about my grandmother, my father's mother, who I had never met. I call her Ba. And, I heard stories about her being a very devoted Buddhist and really bringing compassion into her life. Like one story I really remember is that she had no money, but when she did have a few pennies, she would go to the market where they sold birds in cages, either as pets or maybe as food. I'm not sure. But she would buy them and then let them free. And that was like her practice.
Wow.
So those stories really stuck with me. And then other stories that my father told. He was in Vietnam during the war, what Americans called the Vietnam War, what Vietnamese called the American War. So 1960s. And at that time, there was a great teacher who was young at the time named Zen Master Thich Nhat Hanh, who has since become, quite world famous. And you've studied with him also. And so at that time, he was really bringing what was then called engaged Buddhism, pretty new concept, to bringing mindfulness and compassion to a war-torn country and to number one, calling for peace, and number two, healing the wounds and the destruction of war. And so my dad was a part of that movement in the 1960s, and he's from Hue, which is the kind of center of Vietnamese Buddhism, and that was where Thich Nhat Hanh's root temple was, and a lot of the engaged Buddhist activism was based in Hue during that time too. So I heard these stories growing up. I went to a Vietnamese temple in Charlotte, North Carolina, which is where I grew up. And, to be really honest with you, I wasn't that interested in it at the time, when I was, preteen and early teenager. There's lots of reasons for that. I think we might want to get into that later, about internalized racism and identity development and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
But anyway, fast forward to when I was a young adult. I was in undergrad, and I started getting more interested in learning about engaged Buddhism and Thich Nhat Hanh on my own terms. And so here I have to credit a really influential professor of mine named Dr. Mark Uno, who's now a professor in Oregon. And he's a Buddhist studies professor. And so I took several classes with him. And I read a lot of Buddhist literature, including Thich Nhat Hanh and many others. And that really got me interested in kind of diving into it, developing a practice, and seeing how it could help my own life. And then the next big event was after I had graduated my undergrad and I was thinking about going to medical school. I was, in my early 20s at this time. This was 1999. And I told my dad, I'd really love to go to Plum Village, which is Thich Nhat Hanh's meditation center in France. I'd heard that he hosted retreats and teachings there. I'd never been. I didn't know much about it, but I wanted to check it out.
Mm-hmm.
And my dad said, "Oh, that's great. I'll join you." So it ended up being like a father-son retreat. We were there for 3 weeks. It was a really life-changing experience for me because that's where I met Thich Nhat Hanh for the first time in person, and also the larger international community, and really, learned that this thing that I'd been reading about and writing about, mindfulness, was so much more than an idea or a philosophy or a concept or something intellectual, but it was really a way of living, a way of being in the world, a way of showing up to pain, to difficulty, as well as to joy and happiness, and something that I could really use in my life. So that kind of set me on a lifelong path. That was in 1999. So, 26 years ago now. And I've tried to make it as much as I can, the foundation of my life. And certainly it hasn't been easy. And there's been lots of turns and ups and downs over that 6 years. But that's kind of how I got into it, through my family, through Thich Nhat Hanh.
Wow, that is really amazing. And also, I'm hearing that there are all these layers of real human, right, kind of challenging times that you got through, and also through this practice and meeting this beautiful teacher who's able to share with you these teachings, which now you share with people in spaces that, and I learned that you were sharing about mindfulness even before it was trendy.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, in 1999, no one knew who Thich Nhat Hanh was, like in the wider Stern world. He wasn't famous yet. But it was such a profound experience for me being in that retreat, that I started to try to both bring it into my life as well as to share it with others in ways that I could. I started medical school in 2000. And then, fast forward to when I was in my pediatric training and my adolescent medicine training in the late 2000s, I was seeing a lot of teenagers who were so suffering profoundly. And many of the adolescent health issues that, doctors like me deal with every day have to do with behaviors and mental health. So these are things like substance use, suicide, risk behaviors, eating disorders, chronic pain, and just the anxiety, depression, the stress of growing up.
Yeah.
And by this point, I had developed my practice enough that I knew from my own experience how much mindfulness had helped me, because I had been through a lot of difficulties in my medical training as well as in my life, just
Mm-hmm.
as everyone has, human things.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly I think in medical training, we experience and face a lot of suffering and trauma that I wasn't really prepared for. No one told me about it when I first
So
started.
you wanted to become a doctor to help others, but during that process, and I'm asking because I think this will help a lot of listeners to resonate with you because, we all got problems, right? And so when you were studying, on the outside, it looks glamorous, but the actual life of somebody going through residency, what was that like? What were the kind of painful, emotional kind of challenges that you went through?
Yeah, yeah, those were really difficult times, medical school and residency years in particular, and very long years as well.
Mm.
I mean, on the one aspect of it was just the sheer exhaustion of it. I mean, I had no idea, honestly, that we would be working 80 hours a week, that we would be working 30 hours at a time without sleeping. Like, no one told me these things,
Wow.
you know, all day, overnight. So there's just the sheer exhaustion and sleep deprivation. So
Right.
that's one thing. But the other thing is being faced with suffering. And so we, as part of our jobs in healthcare, whether it's medical or mental health, I think we all experience this. We are face to face with suffering. We're face to face with people who are in pain, both emotional pain or physical pain. We're face to face with people who are dying. And sometimes we feel like we can't do a lot about it. Like we don't have a fix. A lot of these things are not something that I can prescribe a medication and that's going to fix the problem.
Mhm.
And so
Right.
then what do we do? How do we handle that suffering? How do we handle being faced with death. And it, it brings up stuff for us too, because we're also humans. And many of us who come into healthcare, we have, what's sometimes called empathy, which means that we feel what other people feel. And that's both a gift, but it's also can be very dangerous, because if we feel the pain and we don't know how to practice with it, we don't know how to manage it, then we're going to just take that on and it's affect our own health. And so sometimes that's called secondary trauma. Sometimes that's called compassion fatigue. And we have to have a way to deal with it. And so for me, when I was in my medical training, mindfulness was really important in helping me to manage it.
Right.
And so it helped me to get through those times.
Yeah, I absolutely hear you. So when you're working with people in pain, witnessing, grief, death, and these other things that you were saying are challenges, right, for teenagers especially, and it triggers something in you. It sounds like you're using mindfulness since then. What does that look like when you use mindfulness to navigate this feeling of your own trigger, trauma, or compassion fatigue?
Yeah, so it really starts with myself and holding my own suffering. And one of the things that took me a while to really understand about mindfulness, I mean, I guess we could back up, like, what is mindfulness to begin with?
Mm-hmm.
And I think the pop culture definition is like focus and present moment. And, that's only one part of it. That's true. But the other part of it, at least in my training with Zen Master Thich Nhat Hanh and coming from more of that Buddhist tradition, is that you have to combine that present moment awareness with what I just call unconditional love. You can also call it compassion, friendliness, and it takes that combination for the mindfulness practice to be actually helpful and healing. Because if we're aware of something in the present moment, like I'm aware that I'm upset, I'm distressed, I'm suffering, I'm in pain, but I don't know how to bring love to that awareness, then it's just going to actually worsen the pain, the suffering, the distress. So I really, learned how to bring love to my own pain and turn towards pain and turn towards suffering. Zen Master Thich Nhat Hanh has a famous saying. He says, the way out is in. The way out is in. The way out of suffering is actually to turn towards suffering and to hold it and learn how to be with it and to heal it. He gives another metaphor, like it's like holding a crying baby. And so when a baby's crying, it's in distress, the best thing to do is not to turn away from it or to ignore it or to blame the baby or to pretend that it's not crying. The best thing to do, you can't argue with the baby, tell it to stop crying. You just hold it with love. And so to me, that's what mindfulness practice is. And that's how I started, in that first 10 years, really just starting with myself. How can I hold the pain that I'm experiencing when I'm with suffering, when I'm confronted by other people suffering, or when it's my own suffering for other reasons? And then, then it became, if this benefited me so much, how could I offer it to others? Could it be useful to my patients? Could it be useful to teenagers? And so that I started exploring that in the late 2000s, early 2010s. And that was just when mindfulness started to become, quote unquote popular or get in the popular culture. But when I first started talking about it, it was kind of, it's kind of a weird thing. People looked at me like, what are you talking about? What does this have to do with medicine?
Right. Yeah. And I saw that, you graduated at first, your undergrad was psychology, and it became medicine. And then you brought back the mindfulness to the hospitals. And so, and also now you're describing to me this journey that is so beautiful that included, your own coming to terms with how to turn inward. And, it sounds like self-love to me, like a self-love journey. I know this is really hard for a lot of people, including myself, the clients that I see. And yet you're able to get teenagers, right, of all people to be interested and to buy in. How do you do that? Has this got anything to do with your Center for Mindfulness at the BC Hospital? Like, can you tell me, all the devious, amazing, creative ways that you have undertaken to get mindfulness, to the people, to young people?
Yeah. So I first started bringing mindfulness to medicine with one-on-one patients who I saw just in my clinic in individual visits who were having pain or anxiety or depression. And just started talking about this practice of holding the pain, of being present with it. And even, some short meditations that I did with young people that, that I had been practicing myself.
Mm.
Then I also started looking into what else was happening in this world. And one really important stream that's been very influential in my practice, besides Thich Nhat Hanh's teachings, has been the work of Jon Kabat-Zinn, who is a scientist from Massachusetts who developed called mindfulness-based stress reduction, which has been hugely influential in bringing mindfulness into Western medicine and healthcare. And Kabat-Zinn was deeply influenced by Buddhism also, including Thich Nhat Hanh. But he brought it to medicine in a way that was more secular, that kind of removed a lot of like the Buddhism spirituality, so that a way it was more a kind of approachable for Westerners and for Caucasians and people of European descent, really. And then he did a ton of research on it too, and led like a whole field of research showing that it actually can be shown scientifically to help. So I got very interested in that during my training and early in my career, and then started to bring some of that work as well as some of my own clinical experience and my mindfulness teaching with Thich Nhat Hanh into a course for teenagers. So that was really my first deep dive into bringing mindfulness into medicine, was my course for teenagers. It's called MARS-A, Mindful Awareness and Resilience Skills for Adolescents. And I worked with a colleague named Dr. Jake Locke, who is a child and adolescent psychiatrist at my hospital at BC Children's Hospital. And we co-developed this together. We kind of used mindfulness-based stress reduction as a loose template, but also brought in a lot of our own clinical work and our own mindfulness practice experience. And that's been, a tremendous success and really the cornerstone of a lot of other work that's come since then, bringing mindfulness into the hospital, bringing mindfulness into healthcare, and the BC Children's Hospital Center for Mindfulness. But yeah, it started with MARS-A, Mindful Awareness and Resilience Skills for Adolescents.
Right. And you've done a lot of research studies on it, and it's proven to be a program that works and benefits all kinds of people from all kinds of backgrounds, and especially for teenagers. How is Mars for teenagers different? What made it more teenager friendly?
Mindfulness-based stress reduction is a 2.5-hour program, and it has a lot of kind of cognitive content, a lot of intellectual content, and also some longer meditations. And so what Dr. Locke and I wanted to do is make it more teen friendly and more developmentally appropriate. So we took many of the practices in mindfulness-based stress reduction, which frankly were the same practices in Zen Buddhism, and we adapted them. So a number of things we did was we made them shorter. We made the facilitation style much more informal. One of the things about working with youth that's really important is connecting with youth. Because there's a famous saying like youth don't, or people in general, they don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. That's especially true with young people. So we have to have a connection. We have to have a therapeutic relationship with them.
Right.
We bring in a lot of humor into it, so that way it's fun, because that's also developmentally appropriate, is that young people learn through play and playfulness. And so we bring in that kind of spirit into the practice and the teaching. We do offer a little bit more guidance than a typical MBSR teacher might offer too, especially in this process called inquiry, where we kind of look into what their own experience is. And I'd say the last thing is a sense of community. That's actually really important for us. That comes partly from my own background in Buddhism through the Plum Village community, where Sangha, the word for community, is a really important part. It's not so individualistic. It's not like I'm here and I'm going to learn what I can take out of it. It's more like, how can we be here together? How can we connect and support each other? And I really see that as very appropriate for teenagers too, because one of the things that teenagers are looking for and trying to figure out in their own identity development is, where do I fit in? Who am I and where do I fit in? And we know that connectedness, the research has shown that over many decades, connectedness with positive peers and positive adults is a huge protective and resilience factor. So we really try to leverage that in the mindfulness course. And the way it looks is that when teenagers are starting to learn and try these practices on their own, they get really creative. And that's one of the things I love. They find ways to bring the practice into their own lives, into their, real life situations, and then they teach each other. So an example might be, we'll go around the room at the beginning of a class and we'll just say, how has mindfulness been for you? Have you tried any of these practices that we talked about? And, some teenager might say, yeah, I was getting really anxious at school. We had a test coming up. I started to freak out. But then I remembered I could do this meditation. I could do a breathing meditation or a body scan. And that I just did that in class. I didn't tell anybody I was doing it. I just took, 2 or 3 minutes before the exam just to get into my body, get present. And that helped me manage the anxiety. It helped me be more present for the test, and the test went a lot better. So that would be just one example. But we get examples like this every time. And then when that happens, first of all, I'm really proud of the teenagers for finding the practice, for making it really relevant. And second of all, I want to get out of their way because then they're teaching other teenagers and then they become their own best teachers and teaching
Wow.
each other. And there's that sense of community. And then my job as the facilitator is really just to hold the space. And that's where the magic happens, is when the teenagers are inspiring each other.
Wow. In hearing you describe this, I feel like it's so beautiful because when you alluded earlier to, growing up as a teenager in America, having internalized sense of marginalization, right? And here, you're bringing this Zen, practices and also very non-religious, applicable to everyone practices to create belonging and community for young people. I love the lack of hierarchy like that I'm hearing about, because it's like they made it their own. Yeah, that's really amazing. Can you share some stories of, because I know mindfulness for an exam, right? That's challenging in a teenager's world that could feel life-threatening. But, there's also struggles, especially in Vancouver, with addiction, with all kinds of layered, traumas. And can you give me some examples about with these really deep impacts, how you have witnessed these practices, or how do you help? Maybe it's a combination of your medical as well as the mindfulness aspect.
Yeah, I can definitely think of a few stories that have really inspired me. One story, this was kind of early in my work in this area. I remember talking to a young person who was using a lot of cannabis, and I asked him, you know, why do you use it? That's actually one of my favorite questions. Instead of like judging someone or telling them to stop, it's like, I want to know, why are they doing it? What are they getting out of it? And what he said was, well, I just really like the breathing part of it because that helps me to be calm when I get anxious or stressed. And I said, oh, well, would you be interested in just working on the breathing part? Because maybe you don't even need the cannabis. Like maybe the breathing is actually the medicine, not the cannabis. And he was like, oh yeah, sometimes I actually do that. Like even though there's not really any cannabis, I just do it anyway for that. And so that kind of got us on this road of, practicing some breathing meditations, and he ended up using cannabis less because of that. So that was one example. Another example, there's a young person I work with who has been struggling with opioids and comes in for a treatment, which is quite painful. It's an injection. It's called Sublocade. And we do a lot of mindfulness every time he does that because this person finds it helpful, and not like in a very formal way. It's not like, okay, now it's time to do the meditation. Let's put everything aside. We bring it in, we mix it in with other elements like that connection, that playful element. But when it's time to do the painful procedures, we might just say, hey, let's do a few breaths together, 3 breaths. And then we're all breathing together too. And literally everyone in the room there's that connection. It's not just like I'm telling you to do it and you do it, but let's do this together and we're all in this together. That's really actually the spirit of Mars A as well. And then one last story I can share that's been quite recent. I was, as a medical school faculty member, I often get emails from medical students or trainees saying, hey, I'd like to meet with you, or I'd like to hear more about your work, or, is there any opportunities to work with you? So I got an email from a medical student last year, and it started out basically like that. But then as I read further, it really changed. The person said, you might not remember me, but I remember you from when I was a teenager many years ago. And I was dealing with chronic pain and chronic illness. And I took your mindfulness course. And that made a huge difference for me. It really helped me to deal with my chronic illness. And it also made me want to go into medicine and be a doctor so I could help other people. So is there any chance to work with you? And I said, well, I mean, given that story, like I had to say yes. Um, yeah. So now I'm working with her. Now I'm working with her, and she's actually helping to make the mindfulness course better. Um, she's helping to revise it, and in particular, to make it more friendly and applicable to some of our most marginalized young people in British Columbia, which is Indigenous youth.
Wow. So that's immense and that's really huge. I still work in the Northwest Territories and I have a
Mm,
experience working with also witnessing teenagers having struggles because of, all of those residential school impacts and layers. Your program would probably be really helpful there. So I will try to connect this program to them somehow.
nice.
Yeah, it's really good to hear that. I know that nowadays in the world, a lot of people are getting really bogged down by, what's unfolding and feeling politically or, really disenfranchised. But when I witness a person like you and the community, right, that you are connecting and connected to, including, this young woman who is now part of, making engaged mindfulness and healing happen, absolutely amazing.
Yeah. And just to be clear, the med student herself, she doesn't identify as Indigenous, but we are working with an Indigenous physician who I also met many years ago and introduced mindfulness to. Her name is Dr. Ellie Parton, and she's a real emerging leader in this field and teaching all of us actually how mindfulness practices and traditions coming from Zen Buddhism have so much in common with Indigenous wisdoms and teaching, and how they can go together in this really beautiful way that honors both tradition. It's not about like blending and appropriating. I mean, we have to honor both traditions and the histories, but they can also really support each other and complement each other. And so that's what I'm learning through this whole process. And we're still at the early stages of this work, but I think it's really exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so exciting. And also, it sounds like it's about honoring our connection, right, to the earth, to, beyond capitalism, beyond, all the isms that have made us feel the way we feel when we're suffering. Yeah, so I saw you in this video where you were like throwing little brains at people listening to your talk. Yeah. So, tell me about how, that helps people learn about the brain. Like, teach us a little bit about what you were doing there.
I don't remember exactly this talk, but I do have a little. Let's see if I don't know where it is. I have a little squishy brain
Yes.
somewhere, little model of the brain.
Right.
But I think it's really important for both young people as well as their parents and their health providers to have a at least very basic model of how the brain works, and how it can kind of go a little haywire, but also how we can bring it back online.
Mm.
And so I think what I was doing there was sharing what's called the hand model of the brain, which I learned from Dr. Daniel Siegel. He's a psychiatrist, and it's a very concrete model of how the brain works. You want me to share it with your
Yeah,
listeners now?
that'd be great.
Yeah, yeah. So you can hold your hand up
Mm-hmm.
and imagine that your arm is your body and that your hand is your brain. And then if you put your thumb in your palm, this is the lower part of the brain. Scientists will call it like the limbic areas. This is the part of the brain that is responsible for emotions, for stress, for anger, for the fight, flight, or freeze response. So when we get stressed out, this part of the brain gets activated.
Okay.
Sometimes also call it the lizard brain. And the reason we call it that sometimes is because it's very similar to the brain of a lizard. And it's a very kind of ancient part of humans. It goes back,
Is the amygdala kind of the brain?
the amygdala is part of that. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So it's a very kind of primitive part of the human brain. And its purpose is to keep us alive in the face of danger. So it's a really important part of the brain. But then we
Mm-hmm.
also have this other part of the brain. So if you bring your fingers down, and you see like right here where this part of your finger is in the front, that is called the prefrontal cortex, or sometimes I call it the human brain. And these are more kind of complicated parts of the brain that help us with things like regulating emotions, having insight, empathy, compassion, impulse control, those kinds of things. And these two parts of the brain are really strongly connected. So they're touching, and this represents, millions and millions of nerve connections, where the human brain's job, or the prefrontal cortex's job, is to know what the limbic areas are saying and then interpret it and then help to regulate it in a way that helps to make sense or to help make good decisions.
Mm-hmm.
What can happen when we're stressed out is that the lizard brain gets overactivated, and then it can overwhelm the human brain. And so we kind of flip our lid, we lose our mind. And so we can open our hand, imagining that we're flipping our lid. So in those cases, the lizard brain is taking control, and we might be, saying things or doing things that just hurt ourselves or hurt others. It's a
Literally
very
freaking out.
freaking out totally. And that's a very human thing to do. And it's especially common for teenagers, because the way the teenage brain develops is that this part of the brain is actually more mature than the prefrontal cortex in early to mid adolescence. The prefrontal cortex that's actually growing and developing during those adolescent years, really kind of like 12 to 25.
Okay.
So, So there's the bad news. But the good news is that with mindfulness, we can be aware of it. We can even just recognize, oh, my lizard brain's activated. I'm flipping my lid. I'm freaking out. I'm losing my mind. Can I get out of the situation into a safe place where I can bring my human brain back online? And so, it's a dynamic relationship between the human brain and the lizard brain where it can come on and off and on and offline. And what mindfulness is, it's actually a practice to bring the human brain back online, to re-engage that prefrontal cortex. And the more we practice it, the stronger those connections get. And that's especially important during adolescence because that's when the adolescent brain develops. And if we can have a repeated practice like this, those neural connections can actually hardwire into the brain. So that way they become, a long-term part of the brain. That's our hypothesis, at least.
Yeah. And it really helps us to understand, right? When, somebody, let's say, if you're bullied at school, and then you kind of flip your brain and then you start maybe even bullying, people at home, right? And you're
Absolutely.
like, I'm not like that. I don't want to be like that. And what I'm hearing from you is that this is actually kind of unconditional love. So
Yeah.
this is like the breathing and I don't know what other practices, that you might want to share with us that are part of that integrating. And then hopefully we can dance like more than lizards with better brains. Yeah, it makes sense. What other practices do you want to share that will help teenagers, right? Because I think you have this app with a lot of
Mhm.
amazing practices. Can you tell us a few more that will help?
Yeah. So I broadly describe two general categories of mindfulness practice. The first one, sometimes it's called formal meditation, and that's where we take time just to cultivate that mindfulness. And, I think we're thinking about maybe formal is not quite the right word anymore, especially for teenagers. So maybe we call it like dedicated mindfulness or intentional mindfulness, where we
Mm,
take time. And that might be 3 minutes, it might be 20 minutes or 30 minutes. And so examples of that are the sitting and breathing meditation, which is, a kind of a foundational meditation practice, but it doesn't work for everybody.
mm-hmm.
There's walking meditation, where we bring our mindfulness to our steps. There's eating meditation, where we put our devices away and just eat. There's body scan meditation, where we maybe lie down and bring our awareness to each body part at a time. So those are some examples of intentional or dedicated or formal meditation. And then there's the other kind of general category, which is sometimes called informal, or I might call it spontaneous meditation or spontaneous mindfulness. And whether you call it meditation or mindfulness, I think that's a bit of a semantic point. But this is practices where we don't actually have to take extra time to do anything. We just bring that same mindful awareness into something that we're already doing in our day-to-day life. And I always invite young people to think about what's something that you already do in your day-to-day life that maybe you kind of do in autopilot. You're not really paying attention to it. You're not thinking about it. You're just kind of going through the motions, but you're really thinking about something else. And then the
Yeah.
next time you do that, can you maybe bring that same mindful awareness to that activity? And it could be something as simple as brushing your teeth or eating your breakfast or getting dressed for the day or brushing your hair or riding the bus to school, something like that. And so with that, that's actually where rubber meets the road, where we're bringing mindfulness into our daily life. And with teenagers, we present a whole range of practices and we invite them to experiment with them. So all of those practices I mentioned, we do some loving kindness meditations as well, some self-compassion meditations. We basically give them a menu, a buffet, and we say, hey, would you be willing to give this a try with an open mind for the time of the course and see what your experience is and see what works for you. And then at the end of the course, we say, hey, what have you tried? What has been helpful for you? And what has not been helpful? And would you like to continue any of these practices? And I always love hearing what they say because it always surprises me. There's some practices that some teenagers love, like the body scan, for example. And then will be other teenagers who say, no, I don't like that one. That one didn't help me. But what I did like was the sitting meditation or the walking meditation. And so that's why we offer a variety, because I never know what a teenager is going to find the most helpful. Uh,
Yeah. And, everybody is different. Everybody likes different kinds of food. So it
absolutely.
makes so much sense to me that you're like, here's the whole buffet, you
The
know.
buffet.
So yeah, I have a buffet of options, including this app called the Breathr app, which is so cool. That was how I was convinced that I need to stalk you because I also want to get my clients to use it. Yeah, can you tell us a little bit more about this app and, why is it so beautiful and cute and what are the different elements on there?
Yeah. So we first started this app as a collaboration with the Kelty Mental Health Resource Center, which is part of BC Children's Hospital. It's a really public facing kind of office that helps bring mental health resources and learning and education to the public. And we wanted to create a mindfulness for youth. And there were a few at the time, but none of them were quite what we had in mind. So we developed this together and really intentionally made it pretty simple, not too much stuff, and actually using the exact same meditations that I use in the Mars A course.
Okay.
We had youth input as well. So the youth actually helped us to design it, what would be youth friendly, what they're looking for. And then the most recent revision of it we did about a year ago, which is to broaden that audience. Because what we were hearing over the first few years of this app is that parents would say, oh yeah, my kid is using it, but I also really like it too. And then
Mm,
same with health professionals. Health professionals would say, oh yeah, I'm recommending this to my patients, but I also really like it too. And so then we thought, could we expand the content just a little bit so that way it has some things that are useful for both parents and caregivers, as well as for professionals who are working with young people, but
mm,
still keeping it very simple,
mhm.
still not overwhelming the user, because I think a lot of apps have great stuff, but it's just so much. I mean, some of these apps have hundreds or thousands of meditations, and it's like, well, how do you even start? How do you navigate all of that? And so our idea was, which is consistent with my own practices, you don't actually need a thousand or 100 meditations. You just need a few that you practice regularly and repeatedly. And mindfulness actually is a very repetitive practice, but when we're in the present moment, every time we do it is different. So breathing meditation, it might sound really repetitive, but every moment is different. So every breath is different. And so that's kind of our spirit, to keep it simple, also to keep it completely free. So
Mm,
you don't have to give your information, your email address or your phone number. And the free part is that there's no in-app purchases, sign up for level 2, level 3, nothing like that. It's just 100% free. That's made possible by donors. And
okay.
so anyone who's interested in supporting this kind of work can make a donation to the BC Children's Hospital Foundation and ask for it to support the Center for Mindfulness, because that's how we're able to support all of this work and make it free.
That's very cool. So yeah, let's donate to this cause. I have a personal question to ask. Like there's a journaling bit and I'm like, if I journal on this, you get to hear all my dark thoughts. How does this work?
No, that we don't get any of that information.
No, it's just for us to
Yeah,
use.
yeah, that's right.
Okay, because I know a lot of people want to journal and then, they only have their phone and then, too lazy. Great. I'm
Yep.
glad this is private. And I see that, there are all kinds of practices to do with like every sensory aspect of experience. Really amazing. What's your favorite way to get mindful?
Yeah, I think my favorite one is walking meditation. And, when I'm with the Plum Village community, we do a lot of walking, especially outdoors, which I really love. And I have really fond memories of doing these long outdoor walking meditations with Thich Nhat Hanh and with, sometimes hundreds of people. And so it's just like kind of a wave of energy. And we're walking very slowly. We're walking quietly. We're aware of the environment and enjoying nature, sometimes stopping to take in a view or to appreciate a tree or a flower or something like that. So it just really helps me to feel connected to the nature, to my environment, and also to be moving. Sometimes sitting still is hard. And
Yeah.
so sometimes moving meditation. So that's kind of my personal go-to, but it depends on what the situation is. I mean, I practice a lot of different ones, but yeah, that would be my favorite if I had to rank them.
Amazing. And, being a person as busy as you are, like you're researching, you're teaching, you're being a doctor, what is a realistic, kind of amount of time to practice? How much time do you get?
Yeah, I think for myself, I try to do a formal meditation every day. And when I say every day, I put that in air quotes. 5 days a week is pretty good.
Hmm.
6 days a week is even better.
Yeah.
I try to have meditation in community as much as possible. And I have multiple communities, both, in where I live in the Plum Village style. So mindfulness practice community of Vancouver, for example, as well as professional communities. And I've been really lucky, but also very intentional to build communities of mindful colleagues in healthcare who also practice mindfulness. And what I tell people when they ask that question for themselves is, what's more important is that you make it consistent rather than how long it is. So every day or 5 days a week, even if it's only for 30 seconds or 1 minute, is better than I'm going to try to meditate for an hour on the weekends when I have time. It's really a matter of making it part of everyday life and
Mhm.
also bringing in these spontaneous or informal mindfulness practices, bringing mindfulness to everyday moments. I think those are really the start of it. And then depending on how life is and how busy things are, there'll be ups and downs with the formal meditation, but that's okay.
Wow, that's amazing. You make it sound so accessible and doable. And, I feel like there's no right or wrong and there's no judgment. So I hope this encourages a lot of people to check out the app and maybe check out these communities that you're sharing about. Thank you so very, very much for your time and for sharing with us of things that really resonate, I think, as human beings in terms of challenges, all of these intersectional layers and how you found your way to being somebody who's really making such a big difference in the world. Yeah, so grateful for you. Thank you.
So much. I've really enjoyed this conversation and may it benefit your listeners and all people. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Wow, isn't Dr. Zumba so cool? I really love how he integrated his own experiences, his own challenges into superpowers that empower other people. I love that he made mindfulness so accessible. So do check out his Breathr app as well as go to one of these retreats or seminars that he is part of. It's coming to BC soon, the Buddha and the Scientist. This is a retreat that has greatly impacted me as well and my practice. So I do hope you'll have a chance to go there and immerse in its magic. I'm really grateful for these wonderful conversations, and I am so glad you could join us. I hope you feel inspired and maybe even try a little bit of mindfulness. Share with me in your comments how it goes for you. Okay, sending you off with lots of love. As always, thank you so much for following, subscribing, and sharing. I am Zoe Ho, somatic therapist, and you can find more information about booking with me through avalotherapy.com as well as through my social media. Everything is linked below in the notes. Let's connect soon. Take care. Bye.